Coming up on Stonation. The big question is, what is ham radio? So you're telling me that astronauts use ham radios?
That's correct.
Wow. When they're out in
That's
outer
right.
space?
I've talked to the International Space Station dozens of times.
I don't want to say eavesdrop, but do they monitor
Absolutely.
your traffics? How much does a Winlink email system, does that cost anything, or is it a subscription? Or So how long do these classes take? So how much do these exams cost? That's crazy. You can build your own antennas.
Absolutely. In fact, that's the cheapest thing to do.
So you get your exam, and then you have to be in school under those subjects, and then you can get a scholarship?
Yes.
Can shortwave actually penetrate through the atmosphere into space? Welcome to another episode of Stonation, a production of Park Media. Before I introduce today's guest, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, share, and leave a 5-star review. And if you find this podcast useful in any way and want to pay us the ultimate compliment, head on over to our Patreon page where you can subscribe to be a classic, stealth, or beast mode subscriber. What's going on, Stonation? I'm super stoked to be able to present a 2-part mini-series all about ham radios. I've been wanting to do this episode for quite some time, but it took some time to find an expert in the field. And well, boy, did I find an expert in Lewis Thompson, the VP of Austin Amateur Radio Club. I'll be honest, I didn't know much about what or how ham radios worked, but after talking with Lewis, I was blown away. While you listen to part 1, you'll learn all the different capabilities of the ham radio, such as the ability to send email over radio frequencies, how and where you can study for the FCC exams to become licensed, how ham radios have the capability to literally talk all the way to the other side of the world, how best to use repeaters for long-distance communication, and how you can even talk to astronauts when they're in outer space. But the biggest thing that impressed me about this whole interview was that there is a community out there that they've built throughout the nation and even the world, and how licensed ham radio operators are actually everyday people who act not only professionally on the radio, but who also act as civil servants in times of distress. And I want to give context to the location that we recorded this episode. We were in his fifth wheel that was in his covered storage unit, so he could show us his personal setup and equipment he uses while he's on the road. And would you have guessed it? While we were recording, I had to move my van, and Lewis had to bring in one of his sides in so another person could get his RV out. So during this interruption is when I decided to end part 1. But what was really cool about this was that the other guy was also a licensed ham radio operator. I mean, what are the odds of that? Another ham operator interrupts our recording about ham radios. Too canny if you ask me. And I'll let you know right now, you're not going to want to miss part 2, because Lewis talks about the equipment needed for beginners all the way up to an advanced setup, and if you can listen to police and first responder frequencies, and if GMRS and ham can communicate together, and how a group of people actually try to listen to frequencies to try to discover aliens. And we talk about a bunch more awesome information, so be sure not to miss the second part. But don't forget, part 1 ends during the interruption. So without further ado, please sit back, relax, and welcome Lewis Thompson to the Stonation family. Well, welcome to Stonation, Lewis Thompson. I appreciate your time. This is a subject that I'm super excited to talk about because at least in the van life, we just use GMRS radios, and I've heard about ham radios and that they're essentially superior and it has a lot more capabilities, but me and a lot of other people in the community just don't know that much. So I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this. So can you tell the people when did you first start? How has it progressed throughout the years? And because you're the VP of the Austin Amateur Radio Club, right?
Correct.
And so maybe you can talk about a short description of what you do for that club.
Okay. I started in amateur radio in 1961 in high school. It promoted my interest in electronics And so I ended up getting a degree in electrical engineering from University of Texas at Austin in 1970, and worked as an electrical engineer in underwater acoustics and radio propagation for my whole career. I am 76 years old, so I've been in amateur radio for 61 years.
Wow.
And it pretty much defined my my career in a lot of cases.
Okay.
Okay, so that's a basic introduction. My title at Applied Research Labs was Senior Engineering Scientist, and I'm mostly retired, but I'm still on the staff in case there's something they want to ask me. And I also work with the Austin Ionoson, which is a radio propagation tool installed by NOAA and myself. One of 91 ionosons all over the world, to learn more about the ionosphere, because it's not well understood or modeled, but it's incredibly important to long-range HF communications, which is what amateur radio does.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I had no idea that was even a thing, so thanks for working on it. So I guess the big question is, what is ham radio?
Okay, ham radio or amateur radio is a part of the radio spectrum that's used by non-professionals. Mm-hmm. And I might want to define why we are licensed and what it amounts to. First of all, there's obviously a large number of radio services, fire, EMS, you name it, and they all have radio services. And they are licensed through their employer. And they have little or no control over the radio other than push-to-talk and adjusting the receive volume and maybe the squelch. Amateur radio is, but they don't have to take exams or have an individual license. Amateur radio, in contrast, is a service that requires licensing and exams, because the amateur radio operator, unlike the commercial user, he can design, build, and adjust his own equipment.
Really?
And that's good and bad. If you design the equipment wrong, or you make something as simple as turning up the mic gain too high, you will produce spurious and harmonics that will radiate out into the environment and cause significant interference to other amateur radio users, but you can also easily cause interference to the other licensed services. And you're allowed to run significant amounts of power, 1,500 watts.
Whoa.
So you can, depending upon what frequency you're on, you can cause radio interference all the way around the world.
Oh my gosh.
So it's absolutely important that the amateur radio operators not only have a license, but have demonstrated their technical skills by taking exams.
Okay.
And there's 3 classes of amateur radio operators. Technician, general class, and extra class. Mm-hmm. The technician class license is the beginner's license. The exam is actually quite easy to take and pass. Almost grade school children pass it if their dad is helping them.
Okay.
The exams are given by volunteer examiners, but the rules are very strict and are controlled by the FCC.
Okay.
And so the beginner license allows you to operate low power at long ranges, but you have to use Morse code.
Okay.
Otherwise, the regular radio that you can operate is a VHF radio, which has limited range, line of sight, very similar GMRS and FRS. Actually, it's in the frequency bands of the marine radio systems also. But those, so they're able to talk around locally, but they can't cause too much interference. General class is a harder exam. Again, no Morse code is required on any amateur radio class anymore.
Okay.
And a general class lets you use the long-range shortwave frequencies. You're allowed to operate 1,500 watts, and you get to use most all of the available long-range frequencies, as well as the frequencies that the technician class was allowed to use.
Okay.
And so with that class, you can literally talk anywhere in the world, etc. The extra class is just a mechanism that the FCC invented to, you might say, increase the skill level of the amateur radio operator. And when you get the extra class, you get to use a few more frequencies.
Okay.
On the board here are the different frequencies the amateur radio operator can operate on, and they're clear from very low frequencies all the way up to microwave.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's a huge number of available different frequencies. The characteristics and the propagation, how far those frequencies will go, is very dependent on the selected frequency. So a huge area. Interestingly, all International Space Station astronauts, regardless of what country they're from, must hold an amateur radio license from their country,
Interesting.
because there are the skill level to understand how radio operates is an essential component of an astronaut's training.
So you're telling me that astronauts use ham radios?
That's correct.
Wow.
you've-
When they're out in
That's
outer
right.
space?
I've talked to the International Space Station dozens of times.
Really?
I also all of the children's the school. You may have seen a broadcast where a school class gets to talk to an astronaut and then on the International Space Station.
No way.
That is all done by amateur radio.
So you're telling me that anyone can go up and literally talk to an astronaut if they wanted to?
That's correct.
If they were licensed and all that?
On their time off, the astronauts will get on ham radio. The frequencies are well known, and you have a good chance of being able to chit-chat with an astronaut in the International Space Station when it comes overhead. Now, that's the technician class can do that because that's VHF line of sight. And, it's a long way, 400 kilometers to the International Space Station, but it's still line of sight. So you can use frequencies, what we call VHF or UHF frequencies.
Wow.
So just one of the many things you could do with amateur radio.
That's bananas. That's really crazy. Now I have to start doing this because
Okay.
I love stuff like that.
So let's just talk a little bit about other alternatives. The first thing a person should do when they are considering amateur radio or other radio services is, what am I trying to do with my radio? Am I trying to talk across between vehicles on a convoy, for example? Or do I want to talk very long ranges, and do I want to have radio email?
Radio email.
Radio email is available on amateur radio service.
What is that? Like you
Okay,
talk
let-
into
let-
it and then it...
No, let me
puts it in
give
a
you an
word?
example. I was on a research ship, United States Navy research ship in the Sea of Japan, in the middle of nowhere. My choices to send email to my wife were paying $25 a minute for Inmarsat Charlie satellite service, or I could send email to my wife every day by what we call the Winlink radio email system. The way it works is that I have a HF transceiver, just like you see here,
Okay.
a laptop, and special software on the laptop that allows me to operate digitally.
Okay.
I would then sit down and type up a message. I then submit that to the software. It just looks like an email. But the next step is that I have to contact a Winlink internet gateway station.
Okay.
And that internet gateway station was in Bangkok, Thailand.
Oh.
There are in Hawaii, or in Western Australia. That was the three choices I had, no others. And I would contact that station by long-range shortwave radio on specific frequencies when I made a connection. Then the station, then I would send my email, and it would go on the internet and be sent to my wife, and she would receive it on her regular internet email. And I sent it to, Lucy at att.net. Mm-hmm. And it would be from W5IFQ at...
That's your call sign?
Yes, W5IFQ at winlink.org. And that's my internet email. That's my... that would be my Winlink email address, and I have a separate regular internet, but she would know it came from me by radio.
Right.
And she would get the email.
Could she respond?
And then she would respond to W5IFQ at winlink.org, and which is a regular internet site. That message is then put on 6 different servers all over the world, and the next time I connect to any Winlink radio gateway station, it goes out and retrieves my message and then sends it to me by radio.
Wow.
The message is ACNACT in that it sends separate packets. Each packet is acknowledged or not acknowledged by the receiving station. If I send a not acknowledgement automatically, then it sends that same packet again. Same format as the internet uses. Sometimes it's very slow. Sometimes it's pretty fast.
Well, what's slow and what's fast?
200 baud. Fast would be 9,600 baud.
What does that mean? I'm sorry.
Oh, it means bits per second.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, a page of text could take a minute or two to send, but I could also send 20,000 byte PDFs of images, pictures, etc.
Really?
So I could send a picture of what lunch looked like to my wife, and I did a couple of times. It took probably 5 minutes to send the picture.
Wow. All through radio frequencies.
But using HF radio frequencies bouncing off the ionosphere about 250, 300 miles up and going back down to the receiving station.
Wow.
And so that's just one capability. I did the same up and down the east and west coast, the Gulf of Mexico. These were all situations where we did not have satellite or cell phone service, of course. And this started back in the 1980s. The system is completely run by amateur radio operators. The system is anything but amateur. It's absolutely professionally run. Works great. Long-range sailors on sailboats, typically somebody on the crew has an amateur radio license and uses the Winlink system to send and receive email for the whole crew.
Oh.
Now, the only limitation is that since it's an amateur radio service, you cannot use it for commercial purposes. So you can send and receive email, but I could not, for example, send an email to my stockbroker and tell him to sell stock. That's illegal as far as the FCC is concerned, and that's pretty much the rule within amateur radio in general.
Does the FCC, do they regulate, or shouldn't, I don't want to say eavesdrop, but do they monitor
absolutely
your traffic? So it's like
absolutely
it's open source where anyone can like pull out the packet and look at what you're sending?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the packets are very difficult to decode, but you cannot use within the amateur community, within amateur radio, you cannot use any encryption. The digital format may be complicated, but it has to be publicly understood, and there's a lot of different digital modes, but they have to be publicly published in their entirety before the FCC will allow you to use that mode of transmission.
Gotcha.
And you cannot use profanity on the air. You should limit your discussions to technical terms. We discourage political and sexually oriented discussions.
Yeah.
You do hear some of the politics on the amateur bands, but it's not too bad.
So it's not a substitution for a telephone call.
That's correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. And so that's how it's used. But the ability to talk anywhere in the world is just astounding.
So it talks throughout the world by having like a repeater.
No. Now we'll talk about repeaters.
Oh, okay.
Well, let's start. Let's back up a little bit and talk about the technician class license now and what the capabilities are. Again, you have line of sight transmission, but you can run up to hundreds of watts. It's VHF, where GMRC and FRS are UHF. They're up at 460 megahertz, which is absolutely line of sight.
What is FRS? Like what would you use? Is that GMRS frequencies?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Family radio service. I can never remember the exact terms.
Too
And
many
then
acronyms.
GMRS is general mobile radio service.
Oh, okay.
Those are all in the same band.
Okay.
The first few channels of that frequency band are limited to a half a watt, and that's the FRS. And then the GMRC, you have higher power, but you theoretically have to have a license.
Yeah.
I don't know that anyone gets a license, but
I mean, I don't want to like call anybody out, but I know that most people don't have a license for that.
sure. Well, it's again, the radios are such that they're not adjustable. And so they really, again, I can't say that you shouldn't have a license, but I think it's probably unnecessary because you're at 460 megahertz. That's line of sight. If you can't see them, you can't talk to them.
Gotcha.
And World War II radar used by the British most effectively against the German aircraft used the same frequency band. So it tells you how high a frequency and how direct the signals are. So one alternative used by the amateur community is repeaters, which you had mentioned. And so in the VHF and UHF bands of the amateur radio service, there are thousands and thousands of repeaters all over the United States. And we won't talk about the rest of the world, but they're there too. A repeater is simply a receiver transmitter on a very high tower. So I can take this radio, either of these little radios, which basically almost line of sight. But if I go to the right repeater frequency, I would send a signal up at, let's say, 146.34 megahertz, and it would be received on that tower, which is 600 feet up in the air, and then it will be repeated on a slightly different frequency, 146.94 megahertz, for example, a 600 kilohertz offset. Very specialized equipment. It would allow me with a handheld radio to be able to talk all over the surrounding 4 counties in Travis County.
Wow.
And the repeaters are everywhere. Every small amateur community has at least 1 or 2 repeaters. They put them up 100 to 700 or 800 feet, depending upon what tower access they have. Austin Amateur Radio Club, for example, maintains 9 repeaters.
9?
9
Wow.
repeaters, and we spend thousands and thousands of dollars a year to maintain those repeaters. It's big money, and because we can't hire, we have to hire tower climbers. If KXAN or we're on the KVEU tower at 600 feet. We had to hire climbers to put special, expensive coaxial cable all the way up to the antennas, and then we have to have the equipment, which is commercially certified to not cause interference to KVU or any other TVs in the area. And those towers are on both. I wanted to say Well, let's not worry about it. They're on the tallest towers in the Austin area. I can't remember the name of the two mountains, but
one's Mount Bonnell, right?
well, it's actually no, it's
I mean,
anyway. So it's much taller than that. The towers that you see, Buckman,
Okay.
and the other mountain, and so we have to put them on those towers, get permission, and so good clubs will maintain a number of repeaters, and the membership, we have like almost 400 members in the Austin Amateur Radio Club. Their dues go to maintain the repeaters, and we have specialists that build the equipment that's on the ground, and then we have to hire very expensive tower climbers to put cable up that's that big around.
Oh, wow.
We call it rigid coaxial cable because of the losses as you go up the tower.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a very complex business to get repeaters to work. But every club that's anybody, and a lot of individuals will also put up repeaters all over the United States. They'll water towers, cell phone towers, they get permission and then put them up.
Wow.
There's a repeater directory from the Amateur Radio Relay League, ARRL.org.
Mm-hmm.
You can buy that repeater directory yearly, and it tells you the correct frequencies and the tones. You have to put in some cases you have to put in a low frequency tone to open the repeater up, and this prevents repeaters that are close together on the same frequency from interfering with each other. So you dial those kinds of information into the radio using programming software or pushing the buttons, and you're ready to operate.
Wow.
You can put, to improve your ability to use repeaters, you want to have the antenna for the radio outside the vehicle. And so one easy way to do that is a magnetic mount. This is magnets, sticks on steel, and then you connect this coaxial cable to the antenna input to the radio. And this can either be a 50-watt mobile radio that mounts underneath your dash, or it can be a handheld, and this will allow you to talk to the repeaters. You program in the different frequencies, and as you move across the United States, you just switch from one repeater to another so that you can stay in touch clear across a county or several counties.
Wow. That's crazy.
So that's one way for getting a technician class license to allow you to have convoy communications. If you run out of repeaters range to any repeater, then you just go to Simplex, which is where you transmit and receive on the same frequency.
So
And
that's
once-
like GMRS then.
except that you're on lower frequencies
Okay.
and you're running a lot more power, 50 watts.
What does that mean, like distance-wise?
Probably 10 times farther. Also, the fact that you're operating at VHF, 146 megahertz, that will actually follow the curvature of the Earth a little bit. It'll actually refract, where the GMRS frequencies at 460 megahertz will absolutely line of sight. If you can't see them, you can't talk to them.
Gotcha.
Also, if the building gets in the way, anything gets in the way, you're not going to be able to operate. Where VHF, the lower 146 megahertz, will kind of bend around buildings, in between buildings. It diffracts around objects and allows you to have better coverage. So we call that Simplex.
Okay.
And so that's what you can do with VHF. Now, very interestingly, there's a couple of modes where they tie different repeaters together by the internet. And so you can, talking on one of our repeaters here, you can talk to another amateur radio operator in Australia. And the signals go to the repeater. The repeater puts it onto the internet in a very special way, sends it to a specific address. It goes to a distant repeater where it then is broadcast again.
Wow.
And we call that Echolink.
Okay.
Because there's Echolink, there's D-Star, and Fusion. Those are three different digital modes that will tie different repeaters together using the internet. Obviously, it's not a good mode for emergency communications,
Right.
but for just an interest in being able to talk to other people, it can be a lot of fun.
So, what's the delay on that if you're talking to someone in Australia?
It's whatever the electronic delay in a fiber optic cable is. It's almost not measurable.
Okay. So, but it's pretty quick, or is it like
Very
you got to
quick.
wait a couple seconds?
No. You just, I've carried on conversations with gentlemen in Australia, and there's a slight delay, and it's more the mechanics of the radios that have to do it. But the internet is very, very fast. And so there's little or no delay. I would say maybe 1 or 2 seconds. You ask a question, and a couple of seconds later, the gentleman at the other end comes up,
Wow.
and talks to you. So that's just a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
In comparison to long-range ionospheric skip, which I'll talk about next.
Okay.
So
Sorry. Before we go on to that, and before I forget to ask, how much is a Winlink email system? Does that cost anything, or is
Yes.
it a subscription, or
no, it's free.
all of it's free?
It's all free.
Wow.
You just have to buy the hardware. And you have to have a special device that converts the digital signals from the computer into tones that the radio can transmit. We call that a modem.
Okay. So it's like the
In
old
the old days, the modem was $1,000. Now, because of the fast computers and some very smart software developers, they have a program called Vera, V-A-R-A, that costs $60 that replaces the $1,000 modem.
Well, that's nice.
Yes, and so there's really no advantage. I've begun to use Vera, and it appears to work just as good as the modems.
Oh, that's cool.
So let's see, what else can I talk about? Well, so anyway, so that's what you can do with VHF. What the technician class amateur can do with VHF radio. Not only can they talk to the International Space Station, they can also talk to repeaters that will repeat their signals around a county area. And potentially around the world using modes like Echolink, but that's not very practical in a convoy wanting to maintain communications.
Right.
We all probably have cell phones, but one nice thing about being in a convoy is that you can generate a net so that everybody is talking on the same frequency, whether it's a repeater frequency or not. You have to talk one at a time, but you don't have to dial up each and every person separately. So you could have a convoy of 40 or 50 people, and they could individually be chit-chatting about what's going on, what's happening, where we're going. I've got a breakdown. Also, there are a lot of very good weather nets. For example, the tornado outbreak we had on Monday evening, we had the 14694 Central Texas weather net, and they reported, and they have a amateur radio station at the National Weather Service. In fact, most of the National Weather Service are amateur radio operators, and so we were reporting individual weather information from all over Central Texas during that event. We had several chasers that were out there also. So the Weather Service considers the amateur radio community absolutely boots on the ground observers.
Yeah.
And so very important. The repeater that's up at 400 feet for that frequency has battery backup. So even if they lose AC power at that site, the repeater will continue to work.
Wow.
So it's set up for emergency weather communications, and it was very active the whole evening. Very interestingly, they're net controlled, did an excellent job. I can't think of his call sign right off, but the gentleman has been blind since birth.
Oh, wow.
And yet he is an absolute, his memory is great. He was able to operate the net, call different stations, send information to the weather stations, etc. So it's he did an excellent job. So amateur radio VHF technician class people can participate in weather nets, provide emergency communications, whether it be a hurricane, tornado, other kinds of local emergency events.
Yeah.
And that's what the amateur radio community is supposed to do. The FCC wants amateur radio operators to provide emergency communications in times of difficulty, provide a pool of trained radio operators, which was very important in World War II. Hams made up a majority of the radio operators initially during World War II. They donated their radio equipment, which was used in World War II, until the manufacturing process could crank up and build more radios. So it's got a lot of purposes that are useful to the community, besides just the fun of it.
Yeah, no, I definitely can see that now. That's crazy.
Shall I move to long range now?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so for general class and extra class licenses, you're allowed to operate at shortwave frequencies. And these frequencies go up and bounce off the ionosphere. That's the F layer, which is about 250 to 300 kilometers up. And you basically, the first bounce is 1,800 kilometers. And it can bounce off the ground or the ocean, go back up and bounce off the ionosphere again. So you can have 2 or 3 bounces. So you can literally talk anywhere in the world.
Wow.
100 watts can go anywhere in the world under the correct conditions.
So you don't need a repeater then?
No repeater.
Okay.
And this is one of the strengths of HF amateur radio. Is that you don't need repeaters, you don't need satellites, you don't need the internet. You can talk anywhere in the world. The Department of Defense has now told the services, Army, Navy, and Air Force, that you will start teaching HF radio again to your troops, which they hadn't been doing because they have satellites. But now, as we know, our military satellites and commercial satellites can be shot down, disabled, excuse me, and the internet can be interrupted. So suddenly you don't have anything left. As we say in amateur radio, when all else fails, amateur radio will provide the communications. And so that is what's being taught. I do teach classes to the Texas Military Forces in HF radio, and it's essential skill now. So anyway, so we bounce off the F2 layer, 250 miles up. 100 to 500 watts is what I use. You can use up to 1,500 watts. And you have to have the correct kind of antennas to do that, but that can be nothing more than a 20 or 30-foot whip on top of a vehicle or mounted on the ground. And that can allow you to talk anywhere in the world.
That's insane.
I had finished the Capital 10K a few years ago, about, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago, and I was waiting on my wife to finish, and so I was parked on South Congress, and I had my HF Mobile, which is a 9-foot whip on the back of my truck, and there was a contest going on, and DX contest, a distance contest, and I was able to talk to Romania and Bulgaria.
Whoa.
Middle of the morning.
Holy cow.
On Sunday. So that's what you can do. Now that's a little unusual, but this was voice, and I was able to talk to them. In other cases, I talked to Italy on the same mobile unit. If I had my regular station at home with better antennas, I would be able to talk even farther or produce a better signal where the person talking to me would want to actually sit and talk for a while. We call that armchair copy. So you can imagine if you can hear the person's every word, you call that an armchair copy, and so you can relax and talk. And with bigger antennas, I've had armchair conversations with stations in Norway, England, Germany. So, and it promotes goodwill, but it's also just technically fun to do that.
Yeah. You meet all kinds of crazy people, I bet.
And there are also amateur radio contests where you try to work as many stations as you can all over the world. Now, once a year, the last weekend in June of every year, we have the field day. This is where the United States amateur radios all go into the field. They set up their equipment using makeshift antennas, and they have to typically operate on emergency power, and they will talk all over the United States demonstrating these skills. And you get points for every station that you talk to. You get points for how low a power you're running. You get more points if you run low power, etc. And so this is a very popular event that Austin Amateur Radio Club sponsors.
Oh, cool.
And we will have 3 or 4 different stations operating simultaneously, voice, digital, and Morse code. Well, it turns out that Morse code scores more points than any other mode.
Why is that?
Because you get 2 points for every contact. You only get 1 for voice. But also, one of the pieces of information you have to send is, of course, you have to exchange call signs. You have to exchange certain other information, which like your location, city and sector and things like that, and you have to spell that out phonetically if you're doing it by voice. If you're sending it in Morse code, character by character, it's already spelled out. So it's actually more efficient and faster to send by code, but that requires significant skill.
Oh, yeah.
But it turns out that even though it's not required for the license, Morse code has gotten to be very popular within the amateur community simply because it's kind of one of those almost lost skills that the amateurs take pride in maintaining.
Gotcha.
And I'm one of those people.
Oh, yeah?
So I enjoy Morse code.
You're going to have to teach me Morse code.
And there's classes all the time that teach code.
Oh, yeah.
And so anyway, so bouncing off the ionosphere gives you these long-range capabilities.
So can you do that with one of these? Or
No.
do you have to
No.
have
So you have to have frequencies between about 3 and 30 megahertz. So you need you're going to be about to here, there.
Okay, so 24 megahertz?
Yeah, up to what was called 10 meters or 28 megahertz.
Okay.
And that is dependent upon the frequency is depending upon the ionization in the F2 layer. At the ionization of molecules in the F2 layer, which is 250 kilometers up, that's a function of the intensity of the sun, the ultraviolet rays from the sun, also the time of the year, and the time of the sunspot cycle. There's an 11-year sunspot cycle, and it peaks and nulls, and that greatly changes the performance of different frequencies in the HF spectrum. And so we have to select the correct frequency in order to go a certain distance. And that's based upon the time of the year and the time of the sunspot cycle. But it's well understood by amateurs. And we also have to pick this time of day. Obviously, at night, the sun isn't shining, so the F2 layer doesn't go away completely, but it does not reflect as high of frequencies. So we drop down in frequencies at night to be able to get the same kind of distances.
I didn't realize it was that technical. Wow.
It's not well understood even today. I participate in that community of scientists that study the ionosphere. And we have 90 some odd ionosons all over the world. There's one located in Austin at Pickle Research Campus at University of Texas at Austin. And its job is to send radio signals into the ionosphere and measure the height of these different layers and their strength. And then that's put on the internet, goes back to NOAA, to a database where they continue to study the phenomena. If it was well understood, we wouldn't have to have instruments all over the world, but we still do. There are computer programs that help us select the correct frequencies, but it turns out those are not perfect. And there's other things the sun does to us, including solar flares, coronal mass ejections, coronal holes. All of those events caused fluctuations in the Earth's geomagnetic field, which affects the F2 layer. And that can affect the ability to use certain frequencies. But you can compensate for that by changing frequencies if you understand what's going on. So these are all part of what you learn in the general and extra class licenses, and why it's essential that you understand the phenomena to be able to effectively use it to communicate.
So how long do these classes take?
I typically have taught classes. Usually they're about 6 weeks long.
Okay.
But but you can study the classes on the internet. The exams for each of the 3 licensed classes come from a pool of questions, and only those questions are actually asked. So it's a subset of a pool of questions that change about every 4 or 5 years as technology changes. So if you're good at memorization, you could literally memorize the technician class pool and then answer the questions.
Okay.
And doing that, you will learn what frequencies you should be operating on, how you operate, all the phenomena that you need. What I would really recommend is that you take the question pool and then study additional information associated with each of those questions. The ARRL.org, the Amateur Radio Relay League, which is kind of the spokesman for the amateur community in the United States, sells a large number of different kinds of textbooks, license manuals, etc. And the license manuals typically will tell you what chapter of what other book to go to learn more about that subject. So it's an excellent way to learn additional information. And again, it's important to gain this additional knowledge because it can affect your ability to communicate, but also it's information that'll be of importance, as it was to me, in developing a career in electrical engineering. Because I still get out the amateur radio antenna manual when I want to design an antenna for a Navy P-3 aircraft, for example, because it's great information.
Yeah. That's crazy. You can build your own antennas.
Absolutely. In fact, that's the cheapest thing to do. You can buy all of this stuff ready-made, but it's 10 times cheaper just to build your own antennas.
Really?
And they work just as well. Some really good people build their own equipment. That's difficult, but because of a lot of its integrated circuits and surface mount technology now, which is not something the average amateur can do.
Yeah.
But some amateurs do that and build their own equipment. Interestingly, that is done more in countries that don't have a lot of income. The Soviet Union's amateur radio operators are known to be some of the best homebrew operators. They build their own equipment, and the equipment works very effectively.
Wow.
So, a technology a company, a country that has technology, but not a lot of income potential, generates amateur radio operators that tend to build more of their own equipment.
Yeah.
I built my own first transmitter when I was in high school using parts from an old TV.
Really?
My dad went to one of the local TV shops and said my son would like all of your junk TVs and radios, and he loaded up the back of our station wagon, brought them home, and I went through all the different parts, and I was able to eventually build a 25-watt transmitter and receiver so that I could start doing Morse code as a technician class amateur.
Wow.
It was called novice in those days, and we could only use Morse code. We were allowed a maximum of 50 watts, and I talked all over the United States using that old equipment that I had built myself.
Wow, that's so cool.
So, this was all tubes in those days. It was a little bit easier.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of skill set you can develop as being an amateur radio operator.
Wow, you can really, for lack of better terms, tinker around with this, huh?
That's right.
Yeah.
And see, you're allowed to as an amateur radio operator. You can't do that in the other commercial radio services. So you have to have the skill so you don't cause radio interference to everyone else.
No, I totally get it.
So it's just part of the necessity of the niceties of being able to build your own equipment means that you have to have the skill set to not cause interference to everyone else.
Yeah, kind of like how this truck is causing interference.
We could close the door if you wish.
Maybe, because I don't know how long that guy's going to be out. Or wait, sounds like he's leaving.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Anyway, one other, changing the subject for a moment, scholarships. Austin Amateur Radio Club has been in existence since 1916.
Wow.
It was the Austin Radio Club. We had celebrated our 100 years anniversary a couple of years ago, and we have always been a club that has had scholarships available. We've had several different members. The last one, Jim Greenwood, when he passed away, left millions of dollars to us to be used only for educational scholarships.
Wow.
And so we are giving away dozens of $5,000 scholarships each year to students studying STEM, science, technology, engineering and medicine. There we go. Very good. STEM. And we can't find enough people to give the money to.
Really?
The only requirement is that you have to have an amateur radio license and you have to live in Texas.
Oh.
But
okay.
you can get the technician class license by studying on the internet and taking the exams within a week or two.
So you get your exam, and then you have to be in school under those subjects, and then you can get a scholarship?
Yes.
Wow.
Our secretary treasurer will actually, the student, once they are awarded the scholarship, then he tells us what school he goes to, and our treasurer contacts that school and places those funds in the school's scholarship program in such a way that that's used for his tuition.
Yeah, that's a great thing.
And it can be repeated if the student can maintain a reasonable GPA.
Oh.
So we're and if you go to austinhams.org, austinhams.org website, the two scholarships that are available are listed, and the applications and all the information you need accordingly. Also, how to take the exams for the different class licenses are also discussed. They're being given virtually right now because of COVID. There's no in-person classes or exams at the moment, but there are other clubs that have come up with a virtual way to give the exams. It's complicated. The FCC requires that there be multiple volunteer examiners watching each student as they take the exam 100% of the time. So the students have to sit there in front of TV cameras, video systems, and the VEs, volunteer examiners, have to observe these people continuously, and that's one of the requirements that the FCC has placed on examinations to prevent cheating.
Yeah, I mean that's good.
Yeah, it makes, but it's the FCC has a complicated way of requiring the administration of those exams.
Yeah.
But it's all figured out. It's doable.
Yeah.
But the scholarships are certainly an advantage to do that. But Jim Greenwood, the person who gave the money to us, was an amateur radio operator, died of brain cancer all of a sudden, and he wanted to promote amateur radio. And so we very carefully are following his requirements to do that.
Well, that's good. It's very noble. That's
Yep,
awesome.
Yep.
So how much do these exams cost? Like, I assume the higher, not experience, but the higher level of operation, the test would cost more?
The FCC, it used to be the FCC charge for the exams was free.
Oh,
The FCC decided to charge $50.
that's not bad.
The ARRL went to court and fought them, and it's now $35
Well,
for
better.
any of the exams.
Okay.
The volunteer examiners can charge a small amount of money to cover their expenses and paperwork, but we're talking $5 or $10.
Okay.
So it's well less than $75 to take the exam.
So I did the exam for the GMRS one, and that was like $80-some, if I remember correctly. So you're saying to get a ham license, it's cheaper? Well,
Yes,
I
yes.
guess if you add them all up, I mean, it does kind of add up, but not too bad.
Yes.
I mean, we're talking like $100. Like,
Yes.
Huh.
And the reason is that the public service that the amateur radio operator provides, emergency communications, public service, a pool of educated communicators and radio builders, all of those are part of what the amateur community does for the nation. And so that's why for years it didn't cost anything.
I think you hit a really fine-tuned nerve in that, because I had no idea, because I just thought it was another way to communicate, but there's actual, there's a structure and there's a purpose other than recreational / like for, Stonation and everyone that has like a GMRS radio, we just get on there and we're like, hey, let's take it right here, or like I gotta stop to go to the bathroom. That's not what it's really about. It's to actually help for the public good.
That was the purpose in the amateur radio service being formed to begin with. Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes.
That's interesting. I had no idea.
But there's just so many things to do. The amateur radio community has paid for and put up satellites. There are multiple satellites in orbit that are dedicated to amateur radio. There was a very good satellite that has now died that I was able to send a signal up to and talk to a station in France.
Wow.
The satellite had an elliptical orbit, and at the top of its ellipse was very high altitude, and there was a straight line-of-sight path between my station in South Austin and a station in France. And I went up at an amateur frequency of 400 megahertz, which is line of sight.
Oh, okay.
It's going to be...
This chart really helps.
Yes, it's
people
going to be...
watching the
it's
YouTube
gonna
video
be,
probably can't see this too well, but
it'll be 70 centimeters.
Yeah.
So I went up on 70 centimeters, and I heard his signal back down on 1240 megahertz, or 23 centimeters.
So the transmitter and receiver are completely different.
For this service, yes.
Okay, gotcha.
And so as I said, I went up to, and I had to have an antenna that would actually track the satellite.
Okay. So can shortwave actually penetrate through the atmosphere into space? Because you said we could talk to astronauts, but I assume that's
Yes,
through
well,
like
it depends
satellite
upon
and
depends
internet?
upon the frequency you're talking to.
Okay.
I think there's a problem with this gentleman may be trying to get his vehicle.
Oh, okay. Hang on. Let me. Stonation is a production of Park Media. The executive producer is Younghwa Kim. The audio engineer is
Stephen Grasso.
The marketing director is
Hyun Go-sung.
The original music and artist is done by
Jason Wallsmith.
The sound designer is
Lorenzo Indriano.
and the webmaster is
Puncture.
Without any of these people, this podcast couldn't happen, so a big, huge thank you. And a big, huge thank you to you, the listener. If you like this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a 5-star review. This is Younghwa with Stonation, and I can't wait to share the road with you.